Okay, so far in chapter 8 of Srimad Bhagavad Gita, we are studying a section in which Bhagavan Sri Krishna is narrating to Prince Arjuna the method by which one can reach Bhagavan. So and with the special emphasis on what we're thinking at the time of death. So that's been sort of the theme so far in these last few verses, is that the method by which we can reach Bhagavan is by thinking of him in our last moments at the time of death. And when I was first studying these section of verses, I was always curious as to why there was such a emphasis placed on what we're thinking at the time of death. And the main theme, which we've spoken about a lot now, is as you think, so you become. Right? That's the central idea behind all of these verses, is that the content of our thoughts is what shapes our personality and our identity. So when we pay special attention and special care to what we're thinking, we shape the type of person we are becoming and ultimately who we identify with. But why the such attention placed at the time of death? And our teacher told us, he was talking about how the very first thought that we have as soon as we wake up is, very briefly, we have this very impersonal awareness of ourselves, just the idea of I am, just impersonal existence for a split second as we wake up. But that soon leaves us, because our natural and instinctive identification is to go from this I am impersonal awareness to I am this body. And immediately the first thought that we have is, upon waking up, is I am this body who's limited in space and time, who was born on this day, who's going to die, who has this family and relations. So immediately our identity becomes tied to this body upon waking up. And it happens totally naturally without any effort on our part. So what our teacher was telling us was that the same way in which we naturally, spontaneously identify with the body upon waking up is the same type of identification that we must have with Bhagavan. Meaning, as soon as we wake up, if we spontaneously and identify with I am infinite, I am Ananta, I am, I am that Tatvamasi. If upon waking up, the first thought that I have that comes naturally to me, if that is I am Brahman, then we know we've met the criteria of being able to think of Bhagavan at the time of death. Because only when we have that natural identification with Brahman will we be able to think about that at the time of death. So essentially, the main idea here is the reason the time of death is being singled out is because in that moment, we revert to the thoughts which are spontaneous and natural to us, which require no effort on our part. So unless we've been able to do that throughout our entire life and naturally be able to identify with Bhagavan, it will be impossible for us at the time of death to force that type of thinking at that moment. So that's why throughout all of these verses, Bhagavan Krishna is saying that, think of me constantly, think of me all the time, because that's the only way to condition our minds to revert to that type of identification naturally. Okay, so now in the previous verse, verse 12, Bhagavan Krishna was, summarizing everything which he has said so far, the whole process of withdrawing the senses and so we'll go through it actually very quickly. So, first, Bhagavan Sri Krishna, he says, to close all of the gates which lead to the sense organs, meaning don't let our senses be outward looking. So close them off first, close your eyes, don't pay attention to the sounds around you, sit still, sit quietly, close the doors which lead to sense stimulation. Then, after all of those are controlled, place the mind in the heart. And really that is just a way of saying, bring equanimity to the mind. Don't let the turmoils and emotions of the day allow your mind to be pulled into different flows of thoughts. So bring the mind to some level of calm and quietude in the heart where you're emotionally stable and level. You're thinking about what's going on here and now. And then, so after the mind has been placed in the heart, we fix the prana in the head, in the mind. And here, the main idea is, we're getting the breathing under control, but the main idea here is that now that everything, our body is calm, our mind is relatively more quiet, now we're making an effort to bring awareness to the flow of thoughts itself. So, we have thoughts constantly in our mind, but there's also that entity, that light, which is illuminating those thoughts, which is seeing those thoughts. So, after we've have some level of mental quietude, now we're trying to bring our awareness to the seer of the thoughts. We're trying to assume that identity of the Sakshi. So that's the next step, to be in that state of watching our thoughts coming and going without actively participating. So, and that's more easily facilitated by focusing on the breath. The inhalation and exhalation brings our awareness closer and closer to the Sakshi. All right. So now, after doing all of that, what must we do next? And that's what Bhagavan Krishna tells us in verse 13. So he says, Omityekaksharam Brahma Vyaharan Mamanusmaran Ya Prayati Tyajan Deham Sayati Paramam Gatim. By saying while saying the syllable Om, by chanting Om, which is the symbol of Brahman, and remembering me, he who departs the body attains the supreme goal, Paramam Gatim, that supreme state. So essentially, after having calmed the mind, after identifying as the Sakshi, then we chant Om while remembering Bhagavan Sri Krishna. And if we can do that at the time at which we're departing the body, then we will reach that supreme state, which essentially translates as, if we can make that state spontaneous and natural, then we have reached that supreme state. So what does chanting Om have to do with being able to reach Bhagavan? So here, and we mentioned this before on how Om is the container of all the sounds in the universe, from A to M. And we also talked about how Om contains four syllables, right? U, and then the silence which precedes it, which comes before, and the silence which comes after. So when we're chanting Om, in the beginning, maybe we focus on the sound of Om itself, but as our mind becomes more and more quiet, what we're really focusing on is that constant, changeless silence, which is the foundation on which the Om sound is being overlaid. So that the practice, whenever we're engaging in contemplation and eventually meditation, is to, as we're chanting Om, to see from where does that sound arise and to where is it returning again. And that's not just true just for the sound Om, it's true for all of the thoughts in the mind also. It was one practice while meditating is to focus on the source of thought itself. And that practice really brings the mind to the idea that the source of all of this is that ever-changing silence, that foundation on which all this universe appears. So that's the function of chanting Om, is to bring our attention to that which is changeless underneath all the sounds and change of the universe. And in that silence, right, all of this upasana, which we were talking about in the last verses, that all of this is called upasana, preparation for that final understanding. And so once we've been fully prepared, the mind is sufficiently quiet, we're able to see that I am no different than that silence which I'm meditating on, that there's no separation between me and that. And in that understanding, that's when we can say we've finally been able to identify with the total, with Bhagwan, with the whole universe. And one thing which is really tremendous about Vedanta, it's one of probably the thing which is most amazing about this science which we're studying, is that we're aiming for changes which are foundational. They there's this I was reading this one book, and there was this very powerful story which the author was trying to explain. He was talking about how he was on this subway once in New York, and he had a long day. So he was sitting in the subway, and at one of the stops, a man and his two children gets onto the train. And the man, he sits down next to the author, and, just sort of closes his eyes and puts his head back. And meanwhile, his kids are running around the subway and causing mayhem. They're going crazy. So, the author, he's getting more and more agitated. He had a long day. So eventually he gets to the point where he says to this man, I think your kids are causing quite a disturbance. Maybe you should, think about doing something. So now this man, he looks around and he says, oh yeah, you're right. Maybe I should do something. These kids, they just lost their mother and were coming back home from the hospital, and they probably just don't know how to cope. So now this author, he's feeling terrible about himself. He's thinking, I was being so impatient, so rude. I wasn't being considerate. And now all of a sudden, with this one new piece of information, compassion was flowing out of him totally naturally, right? Effortlessly. It didn't require him to force any compassion or generosity at this point anymore. One new piece of information changed his response to the situation entirely. It changed a fundamental assumption that he had about the situation. And by changing that assumption, right, the initial assumption was, oh, this is an irresponsible father who is neglecting his children, who doesn't care. Once that assumption was changed to, oh, this is a family that just suffered tremendous loss, then the response to that experience changes naturally, spontaneously. So in the same way, in Vedanta, what we're trying to do is to change fundamental assumptions that we hold about ourselves and the world around us. So right now, we're all operating under the assumption that I am an individual separate from the rest of the world. And as a result, we have all these different types of experiences in the world, some good, some bad, some tragic, some joyful. And but it's all coming from a misunderstanding about some fundamental assumption that we're holding. So what we're trying to do is to say, no, this fundamental assumption that I have about myself is wrong. I am not separate from the rest of the universe. And once I can know that, once I really know that in my heart, once that idea becomes ingrained in my personality, then the types of experiences I have when I interact with the world will change dramatically, completely. And the best part is that it requires no effort on my part to get those type of experiences. They happen naturally because they stem from a fundamental different understanding, a different frame of reference than I had previously. So that's, something which is really, truly amazing about Vedanta is that we're not trying to just change behaviors. We're not just trying to change our personality. What we're really trying to change is the fundamental assumptions that we regard to be true, that we hold about so many different things in life. But most fundamentally is the idea that I am an individual separate from everything else. That's the one assumption we're trying to change. And by changing it, we change every facet of our experience. All right, so we'll continue with verse 14 on Monday. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti